It is Wednesday, June the 27th, 2018. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through, so therefore we'll pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing within the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are strictly for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online update. The research document this month updates global risk. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report, the macro, regional, and U.S. economic developments. As I so often do, I'd like to tie them together into a single discussion on developments currently unfolding regarding trade tensions and the potential for a very serious global trade war. I would therefore like to cover the items outlined in the agenda here. We have talked previously about Trump's focus on U.S. trade imbalances and the potential for an era of looming global trade wars. We highlighted this most recently in April in a two-part series with Charles Hugh Smith entitled "Were Trade Wars Inevitable?" Since then, President Trump and his administration has taken this possibility to a whole new global headline-grabbing level. Let me point out here as a reminder, whatever complaints the Trump administration may have about trade with China, it should theoretically settle those disputes through the legal mechanisms of the World Trade Organization. If the U.S. thinks it has a case against unfair Chinese practices, then it should trust the multilateral trading authority. Otherwise, as history has shown, it's a recipe for international chaos and a slippery slope to conflict. Frankly, it potentially leaves the U.S. looking like it has contempt for multilateralism with its bullying manner of high-handed unilateralism. Rules? Laws? What's that? Unless, of course, it is worth it if there is a lot more at stake going on here than just trade imbalances. I believe there is, frankly. Trump appears to be playing hardball with China in the belief that its bullying will see Beijing cave to its demands for rectifying trade imbalances. I showed this schematic in prior videos where trade wars were to be expected since they stem from failed policies and unresolved structural problems, as shown on the right in this diagram. What the U.S. is trying to do is solve structural, inherent flaws by strong-arming China into making concessions. Because China's $500 billion annual exports to the U.S. are about fourfold what the U.S. sells to Beijing, Trump is betting, I believe, that his basically Mad Max approach will scare China into submission. I'm afraid that is just not going to happen. He is 10 years in quantitative easing too late. The U.S. economy has been running a chronic trade deficit with the rest of the world for the past 4 decades. That's largely because of a structural change in American capitalism, whereby U.S. companies and investors bailed out of the country to set up in cheaper labor territories such as China, but then, again, not solely China. To accuse China of being the problem is really a deceitful distraction from the way American corporations jettisoned U.S. workers with layoffs and downsizing to improve profits with no policy response from previous U.S. administrations. It is also a failure for the U.S. to not have adequately responded to the advent of the World Trade Organization with resolutions regarding Chinese business practices, Chinese state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, the unregulated theft of intellectual property by Chinese corporations, the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party in subsidizing corporations, and gaining competitive trade advantage through currency manipulation. And though the U.S. doesn't claim that of China, it's a fact. A conflict with China because of this was simply inevitable. However, that doesn't explain Canada and Mexico with the dismantling of NAFTA, nor major EU tariff threats. Trump's browbeating manner is no doubt to some degree grandstanding for his voter base in the Rust Belt states, who might feel a patriotic surge in sticking it to the Chinese. The midterm congressional elections in November are also no doubt on Trump's mind, to get the Republican vote out that he so desperately needs to get more legislation through Congress. However, the president's best laid plans are in danger of veering into a political train wreck. The expected sequence of the stages of negotiation shown here could quickly get out of control. Beijing has said it will not back down to intimidation. In an editorial in the Global Times, which reflects government thinking in China, the tone was very combative. I quote, "It is U.S. arrogance to believe that a trade war will exhaust China, but the boot is on the other foot. Trade is mutually beneficial to both China and U.S. Scuppering bilateral trade would cause similar suffering to both sides." End of quote. The options at Beijing's disposal could wreak havoc for the U.S. economy and Trump's political future. Trump's inability to see that speaks to his and his advisors' possible petulance. Maybe I'm not giving them sufficient credit, or the U.S. economic outlook is that dire and they must do something. So far, we have seen the U.S. tariff threats to be as shown here. Note the right column on whether they have only yet been threatened or have been implemented. This slide highlights the international retaliation to date. Again, note the right column. The bottom line is that as we go to press, very little has actually been enacted to date. So far, it is more about sound and fury. But all that could change on July 6th. Trump is gambling big time. He is betting that China will be the first to blink, as the New York Times reported. That's because the Trump administration reckons that with China's huge trade surplus, Beijing has more to suffer financially in the near term if it goes toe-to-toe with the U.S. in a trade showdown. China has a lot more to lose than we do, according to Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who is an infamous hawk when it comes to dealing with Beijing. Navarro, like Trump, has continually accused China of ripping off the American economy and workers through alleged unfair trade practices and the theft of intellectual property from U.S. technology companies. The Trump administration is fully cognizant of what this chart illustrates. China will not be able to match U.S. trade tariffs in a tit-for-tat manner. There are simply insufficient U.S. imports into China from America for China to enact tariffs on. This somewhat dated chart shows U.S. tariffs on China at a level that is now approximately double this as we talk today. If the blustering continues without resolution and the tariffs are implemented, there will be serious ramifications globally. It is not at all out of line to suggest the results will be to bring on a U.S. recession or worse. Once this occurs, any resolution and hope for benefits will be muted by the economic situation that will be underway. Also, in China, don't forget how unstable the situation is there, as we've outlined many times in a quickly deteriorating global credit impulse. Both will be seriously impacted and quickly. Trump's latest threats now include almost everything coming into the United States. Nothing is being left off his list to get tariffs to his apparent goal of just around $600 billion. Obviously, the financial markets are now beginning to sense the hard realities that are likely to occur. Our historic bull market may be brought to an abrupt end, not by monetary tightening, as has historically been the case, but rather by a self-inflicted profit recession. We're already seeing businesses react. Daimler, in its latest earnings conference call, the Philly Fed just released a report showing a historic lift in 6-month expected prices to be paid by businesses. There is a strong possibility that the inflation genie is about to be released as expectations for price increases build. Corporations have no way of absorbing these tariff rates, and so they will be forced to pass them on to the U.S. consumer in the form of price inflation. Higher retail prices for consumer goods like television and footwear imported from China will crimp household budgets, especially among the lower income population, who, by the way, tended to vote for Trump. The net result is that the fragile American economy would likely tank from a cash-strapped consumer, who are already living on the edge. If China goes ahead with their threats to impose counter tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, such as soybeans, corn, and meat, the impact on farm states like Iowa, Idaho, and Illinois across the Midwest will be severe. Voters from these states were crucial to Trump getting elected to the White House in 2016. By taking the U.S. into a trade war with China, Trump will end up hitting his own political base the hardest. The Chinese are counting on that and are targeting that currently. The far-reaching, injurious effects of a trade war seem on the surface to escape the Trump administration's planning. Many nations now, fairly or unfairly, see the U.S. president as having been carried away with a hubristic notion of American power and an irrational ideological hostility towards China. Critically important is that the perception of America is being changed around the world. This may have far more far-reaching ramifications than anybody currently realizes or appreciates. China is already feeling the effects in a larger fashion, at least so far, than the U.S. 1,000 Chinese stocks dropped 10% in a single day recently after the Trump administration announced their last proposed tariff taxes. All of this forced China, apparently, to attempt to de-escalate the situation, but apparently to no avail. China inbound investment has already collapsed in the last 6 months. According to the research firm Rhodium Group, Chinese companies completed acquisitions and greenfield investments worth only $1.8 billion, a 92% drop over the past year and the lowest level in 7 years. But this is much more than simple mergers and acquisition. It's about capital outflows, which will really upset some of China's wealthiest as they try to find new routes to de-yuanize their assets. The rapid decline in China's FDI in the U.S. was driven by a double policy punch: Beijing cracking down on rapid outbound investment, and the U.S. government increasing scrutiny on Chinese acquisitions through the Committee on Foreign Investment, as well as taking a more confrontational stance toward economic engagement with China in general. Let's step back for a moment and try and make more sense of what actually may be going on here. You've heard me talk many times about the importance of foreign direct investment to China. How does a win-win come out of all this? Or is that even a remote possibility? Who eventually loses and who wins with various potential outcome scenarios? Let's first look at the hand China holds. As we mentioned, China can effectively retaliate through matching tariffs. It will therefore be forced to shift its focus regarding possible punitive actions. As we first consider what we might expect from China, remember, China is very strategic and long-term oriented in its planning, so it can be expected that whatever direction it takes, it will have other important strategic benefits. China could potentially de-escalate tensions by presenting a list of actions it will follow to reduce its significant trade deficits in services with the U.S. China could and will likely launch an economic subsidy for its economy in the form of further easing in financial conditions to offset any potential trade drag. China could unleash differential treatment of domestic enterprise, many subsidiaries of U.S. parents. As some have suggested, Beijing could simply opt not to apply its market access liberalization policy recently announced. This could greatly disadvantage U.S. firms. Beijing could also engage in an aggressive crackdown on U.S. firms operating in China. Apple, for example, which has a $40 billion market there. Hinder border passage of U.S. products, such as automotive, or pursue antitrust and monopoly allegations against U.S. tech names, like Micron. China could also choose a diplomatic retaliation and order Kim Jong-un to settle the recent agreement North Korea signed with the U.S., humiliating Trump by showing that it was Beijing all along who made the U.S.-North Korea summit possible and successful. But China could pick an aggressive route also, and instead of mild appreciation, it could aggressively pursue a weaker yuan to boost trade competitiveness. It needs this, as we previously pointed out in other videos, to improve its foreign direct investments, or to at least maintain it. China could also pick the nuclear option and gradually or suddenly liquidate its treasury holdings. This is a long-running worry by markets, given China's $1.2 trillion in treasury holdings. In January, Bloomberg reported this was a possibility, which was at the time denied by China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange. However, The recent liquidation of half of Russia's treasury was seen to be some sort of rehearsal for what would happen if Beijing decides to pursue this approach. This is all part of a de-dollarization strategy, I believe. What this suggests is that currently it would mean that China will use this opportunity, in my mind, to devalue the yuan. They have already shocked the world once with this, and as we have discussed in previous Under-the-Lens discussions, China's new capital formation and foreign direct investment is critically important to their economic stability. So far, President Trump seems not to have noticed the stealth devaluation already underway, but the world speculators certainly have, as last week we saw the FX speculators dramatically shift to a net bullish position, the most bullish since April 2017, with the greatest swing in positioning in history. And of course, the U.S. markets have been on quite a downturn here for the last 10 days. And as we talk today, it is getting worse quickly. While China's stocks are up marginally, the yuan continues to slide as chatter escalates that China is weaponizing the yuan in retaliation to Trump's actions. This is not anywhere in the media. The real pain hasn't even begun. As we've mentioned, China's ultimate trade weapon is its massive holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. With nearly $1.3 trillion worth in holdings of U.S. federal debt, China is by far the world's largest creditor for Washington. The U.S.-based news outlet Bloomberg calls it Beijing's nuclear option. The media is now beginning to pick up on this, and I quote, "It can't just stop buying U.S. Treasury debt," warns Bloomberg. "China is the world's biggest Treasury investor, keeping U.S. borrowing costs low, helping us buy more stuff from China. Ending this symbiotic relationship just when U.S. budget deficits are soaring would devastate the U.S. economy." End of quote. Bloomberg adds that such a doomsday option could blow up China's economy too. It compares the abysmal scenario to mutually assured destruction, or what was called in the Cold War, MAD. Arguably, though, such mutually devastating economic consequences for China are not moot. It has the alternative sphere of Eurasian economic integration and the new Silk Roads it has been busily building with Russia and others over the past decade. If Trump pushes Washington's belligerent too far with Beijing, the economic ramifications will be wide-ranging and dire for the globe. China will likely survive to trade another day with the rest of the world. But one thing seems sure, with its chronic debt, deficits, and dodo-like dollar, America may potentially be ruined beyond salvation, ruined ironically by a president who touts his art of the deal, a deal that failed miserably. Coincidentally, China's central bank announced that it cut its required reserve ratio, or RRR, for some banks by 0.5 effective July 5th, the day before tariffs are to go into effect, and just over 2 months after the People's Bank of China did a similar cut on April the 17th, the first of such easing since the start of 2016, and all within this period of global trade escalation. The move will unlock 700 billion yuan, or 108 billion US dollars, in liquidity amid growing trade war tensions, a sharp slowdown in the Chinese economy, a tumbling stock market, rising forced margin call, and a spike in corporate defaults in China. China is spinning the RRR as a move meant to fund mass deleveraging through debt for equity swaps, not as the start of an easing cycle which would send the yuan sliding and could potentially be perceived as a stealth devaluation by the U.S., resulting in an even more aggressive trade retaliation. The move will ease liquidity shortages currently seen in the implementation of debt-to-equity programs, and it shows that policymakers still don't want to send a signal of across-the-board easing. The central bank may have predicted rising debt risks in the near future, so it decided to set up such an arrangement. What is now somewhat frightening is what the U.S. is now moving the escalation towards. The U.S. Treasury is crafting rules that would block firms with at least 25% Chinese ownership from buying companies involved in industrial significant technology. The market on Monday, as soon as the Wall Street Journal broke this story, dropped 450 points intraday. The Financial Times reports that, according to officials and people briefed on the discussions, the administration has decided to restrict China's ability to invest in or acquire U.S. companies in the industries identified by Beijing in its so-called Made in China 2025 plan. The Trump administration appears likely to involve an act that allows U.S. presidents broad powers in the event of a national economic emergency, which the president is likely to declare. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, dates to the 1970s and has in the past been used mostly to impose sanctions on countries such as North Korea and Iran. Administration officials argue that the restrictions are needed because the U.S. is in an existential innovation war with China over key technologies that will define the future of the world's two largest economies. Although the exact scope of the investment measures is still unknown, this level of dramatic escalation implies that China hawks have taken the upper hand in the White House, as is clear by Trump trade advisor Peter Navarro's comments aimed directly at Xi's goal of leading the world in sectors from aerospace to artificial intelligence. China has targeted American industries of the future, and President Trump understands better than anyone if China successfully captures these emerging industries of the future, America will have no economic future, while its national security will be severely compromised. This is the kind of strategic thinking that's going on here. The U.S. has more FDI than any other country in the world. As Trade Vistas wrote in Essential on Foreign Direct Investment, the United States is home to the largest stock of FDI of any single country. On the flip side, the United States is also one of the world's most important sources of direct investment, with more than $5 trillion worth of assets abroad. The attractiveness of the U.S. market for foreign direct investment reflects the size and strength of the U.S. economy, as well as the long-standing U.S. commitment to open markets and the rule of law. The vast majority of FDI occurs on a regular basis in every U.S. state across sectors including manufacturing, financial, and information technologies, but there are cases when foreign investment might carry security implications. Tariffs are simply about national security, the Heyman Capital founder recently proclaimed on CNBC that I was watching. There are concerns as to just how all this ends, since, as a former Obama administration official noted, the unilateral move by the Trump administration invokes IEEPA, which would be unusual. That's a pretty sharp departure from the way things have been done in the past. The Trump administration's kind of across the board has very much blurred the line and seems to be saying that any significant economic challenge the U.S. faces is also a national security challenge. We have escalated this to a whole new dimension. We obviously don't know how this will all play out. What is pretty evident, however, is that there is a potential for serious fallout. The U.S. may well win the trade battle, but lose much more as a result. The view of America has shifted, and as we outlined in this year's thesis paper, A New World Order, all of this will only accelerate the global shift to a multipolar world order. There's no question about that in my mind. It will accelerate also the global shift towards de-dollarization, which would undermine the whole U.S. financial edifice. This is much more important. Minimally, we will see short-term profit deterioration if it is not resolved immediately, which is highly likely to trigger a U.S. recession. The IMF is out saying the trade war could push the global economy to the brink of a recession. The bank writes that whereas the good news is that we are still many steps away from a full-blown global trade war, and I quote, the bad news is that the trail risks are rising, and our work and the literature suggest a major global trade confrontation would likely push the U.S. and the rest of the world to the brink of a recession, as outlined in the chart here. We have benefited from globalization, which is responsible for at least 1,000 points in the S&P 500, according to David Rosenberg's research. It has fostered dramatic increases in P/E ratio as a result of net margin expansion. This could be reversed very quickly. China initially was seen in America, in my opinion, as an opportunity, then as something that needed to be contained, but today is now seen as a dangerous competitor. When this happens and economies start to suffer as a result, it historically leads to unresolved conflicts. Any shock can quickly move through the global economy and bring an unexpected retaliatory action. Wars always start that way. I suspect, however, the next war will be a cyber war, which attacks in stealth fashion the financial and economic infrastructure of the nations involved. They will attempt to disrupt competing economies through shocks to the infrastructure. In closing, let's restate what we have laid out in many of our videos. Neither the U.S. economy nor the Chinese economy can presently withstand an economic shock of any magnitude. A trade war with any of its potential shocks is coming at precisely the wrong time. As I always remind you, remember the answer in response will be to print more money, to somehow alleviate any and all problems. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree on, until no one wants it or trusts it. Invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2018 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I thank you very much for listening.